Hi, welcome to the podcast for Chapter 8. In Chapter 8, we're going to look at variable overhead, variable overhead cost, how that makes more sense. Variable overhead cost variance in this section, which I'm calling 8A, and then we'll look at fixed overhead costs in 8B. So, the first couple learning objectives deal with arriving at a variable overhead rate. So when it comes to planning and how we budget our overhead, our guidelines are that we want to plan that efficiently as possible, and we only want to plan the essential activities for variable overhead. We want to do the same thing for fixed overhead, and remember that fixed overhead has a lot of costs that are already predetermined. Decisions we've made mean that we're going to incur these fixed costs regardless, and so we want to make sure that they're accounted for correctly in the budgeting process. One of the things that we do then, and we've learned this term standard cost, one of the things we do is we try to develop a standard cost for our product. And the standard cost of the product really has two variables that we look at. One, of course, is the standard cost of the input. So what is the standard cost for the direct materials? What's the standard cost for the labor? What's the standard cost for the overhead? But also, we have a standard for the quantity, the quantity allowed for the actual output. So if we're going to make one product, how much square footage of fabric, how much glue or nails or other raw materials. So it's not just the cost of those things, but also the quantity of those things. And you recall that we can trace those direct costs and we allocate the overhead costs. So this roadmap, this is where we're headed with our variable overhead cost variances. And ultimately, we're going to determine our flexible budget variance, and then from that we will have a spending variance and an efficiency variance. So the variable overhead cost is very similar to what we did for the price and efficiency variances for direct materials and direct labor. Next week, when we do the fixed overhead variances, those are actually much more complicated and a little bit different than these other three, which are fairly similar. Okay, so overhead is the most difficult cost to manage. It's usually a pretty big bucket of costs, and it's also the least understood because in part there's a lot of different things that cause overhead to happen. It's not just sort of one thing. And so we want to, when we're doing overhead variance analysis, we might work back and forth to try to help explain what caused the variances. So I want to start with the process of how we develop these variable overhead rates. And then I've used some specific information related to the examples that we've worked in, kind of a continuation of the examples we've worked in previous podcasts. So we choose a budget period, in this case like 12 months. We select a cost allocation basis. So in this case, we'll do machine hours. And the information in this example is it's 0.4 machine hours per actual output, so per unit. And this should say times. Let's do that. So 0.4 times 144,000 machine hours gives us 144,000 units gives us 57,600 machine hours. Our total budget for variable overhead cost, 1.7 million. So now we can figure out this rate, right? The 1.7 million divided by the 57,000 machine hours gives us a standard rate of $30 of variable overhead cost per machine hour. Again, if it takes 40 hours per jacket, then we're going to be allocating to each finished jacket $12 of variable overhead cost. All right, so that's sort of our overview. The next podcast will go in to using that information to understand and calculate the variances.